Shalom Ahim, blessings to all. This is your servant and friend Roeh, continuing the class, second class of the Yeshiva. Number one, the principles. Number one, the principles. We will begin the studies with the history of Tanakh presents a literary analysis that recognizes that Tanakh itself manifests itself to be more than the historical account of the Hebrew nation. It is the sacred history that uncovers the revelation that Yahweh makes of himself to man. And in it is recorded not only what Yahweh has done in the past, but also the divine plan for the future of mankind. Chapter 1. The period of the principles. Questions about the origin of life and things have always had a place in human thought. Discoveries of the past, such as that of the Dead Sea Scrolls, are not only a challenge to the scholar, but also fascinate the layman. The Tanakh provides an answer to man's question about the past. The first 11 chapters of Genesis set forth the essential facts regarding the creation of this universe and of man. In the written record of Yahweh's dealings with man, these chapters penetrate into the past beyond what has been definitely established or corroborated by his with reasonable assurance. However, the evangelical unequivocally accepts this part of the Bible as the first and only authentic account of the creation of the universe by Yahweh. The opening chapters of the canon are central to all the revelations set forth in the Tanakh and Brit Hadashah, known as the Old Testament and the New Testament. Throughout the Bible, there are references to the creation and early history of mankind as set forth in these introductory chapters. How should we interpret this narrative of the beginning of man and his world? Is it mythology, allegory, a contradictory combination of documents, or the idea of a single man about the origin of things? Other biblical writers recognize it as a progressive narrative of Yahweh's activity in creating the earth, the heavens, and man. But the modern reader must guard against reading beyond the narrative, interpreting it in a scientific terms, or assuming that it is a storehouse of information about newly developed sciences. In interpreting this section of the Bible, or any other Bible text for that purpose, it is important to accept it on its own terms. Without a doubt, the author made normal use of symbols, allegories, figures of language, poetry, and other literary devices. To him, it seemed it constituted a sensible and unified record of the beginning of all things, as they had been made known to him by Yod-Heh-Bab-Heh through human and divine means. The time covered by this period of the beginnings is nowhere indicated in Scripture. While the terminal point, the time of Abraham, relates to the first half of the second millennium, the other events of this age cannot be accurately dated. Attempts to interpret genealogical references as a complete and accurate chronology do not seem reasonable in the light of secular history. Although the narrative generally follows a chronological order, the author of Genesis does not in any way suggest a date for creation, nor are the geographical details of this period known to us. It is unlikely that the situations of Eden and some of the rivers and nations mentioned will ever be identified. The geographical changes that occurred with the expulsion of man from Eden and with the devil are not mentioned. Apparently, they are beyond the limits of human research. When reading, questions can be raised that the narrative leaves unanswered. These questions deserves further study. Of greater importance, however, is the consideration of what is affirmed, for this material provides the foundation and the background for a greater and fuller revelation of Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, as progressively manifested in subsequent chapters. The creation account, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 25. It starts with "in the beginning," introduces development into the preparation of the universe and the creation of man. Whether this undated time refers to the original creation or to Yahweh's initial act in preparing the world for man is a matter of interpretation. In any case, the narrator begins with the eternal as creator. In this brief introductory paragraph, chapter 1, verse 1 and 2, in relations to the existence of man and the universe. Order and progress mark the era of creation and organization. Chapter 1 of Bereshit, Genesis, verse 3 through chapter 2, verse 3. In the period designated as 6 days, order prevailed in the universe relative to the earth. On the first day, light and darkness was ordered to provide periods of day and night. On the second day, the sky was separated to be the expansion of the earth's atmosphere. It follows in order the separation of land and water, so vegetation appeared in due time. On the fourth day, the luminaries began to work in the sky, in their respective places, to determine the seasons, years, and days for the earth. The fifth day brought into existence living creatures to populate the waters below and the sky above. Culminating this series of creative events was the sixth day. Land, animals, and man were ordained for the occupation of the earth. And on the last day, he was distinguished from the first, being entrusted with the responsibility of having dominion over all animal life. The vegetation was Yahweh's provision for their maintenance. On the seventh day, Elohim finished his creative acts and sanctified him as a period of rest. Man is immediately distinguished as the most important of all of Elohim's creation. Chapter 2, verse 4 through 25. Image of Yahweh, man becomes the focal point of his interest as the story continues. More details of his creation are given here. The Eternal formed him from the dust of the earth and breathed into him the breath of life, making him a living being. Man was not only entrusted with the responsibility of caring for the animals, but he was also tasked with naming them. The distinction between man and animals is made more evident by the fact that he did not find satisfactory companion until the Eternal created Eve as his helpmeet. So as the habitation of man, Yod-Heh-Vav-Peh prepared a garden in Eden, entrusted with the care of this garden. Man was entrusted with the full enjoyment of all the things that Yahweh had abundantly foreseen. There was only one restriction. Man was not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The fall of man and its consequences, chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 6, verse 10. The most crucial point in man's relationship with the Eternal is the drastic change by the former's disobedience, chapter 3, verse 1 through 24. As the most tragic development in the history of the human race, it constitutes a recurring theme in the Bible. Confronted with a talking serpent, Eve began to doubt Yahweh's provision and deliberately disobeyed. In turn, Adam yielded to Eve's persuasion. They immediately found themselves aware of their disappointment and deception produced by the serpent and their disobedience to Yahweh. With fig leaves, they tried to cover their shame. Face to face with Adonai, Creator, all parties involved in this transgression was solemnly judged. The serpent was cursed above all animals, chapter 3, verse 14. Enmity would be placed as a perpetual relationship between the seed and the serpent, which represented more than the present reptile and the seed of the woman. With regard to Adam and Eve, the judgment of Yahweh has a character of mercy, assuring the definitive victory for man through the seed of woman. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. But the woman was condemned to the suffering of raising her children, and the man subjected to a cursed earth. Yahweh provided skins for his clothing, which involved killing animals as a consequence of being a sinful man, aware of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve were immediately expelled from the Garden of Eden, fearing that they would share the tree of life and thus live forever. Having lost habitat of eternal happiness, man faced the consequences of the curse, with the sole promise of eventual consolation through the seed of the woman, which would mitigate his destiny. Of the children born of Adam and Eve, only three are mentioned by name. The experiences of Cain and Abel reveal the condition of man in his new changed state. Both worshipped Elohim by bringing him offering. While Abel's animal sacrifice was admitted, Cain's offering of vegetable was rejected. Irri- irriti- uh, Irritated by this, Cain killed his brother. Since he had been warned by Yahweh, Cain adopted an attitude of deliberate disobedience, thus becoming mankind's first murderer. It is not unreasonable to draw the conclusion that this same attitude prevailed when he brought his offering, which Elohim had rejected. The civilization of Cain and his descendants is reflected in a genealogy that undoubtedly represents a very long period of time. Chapter 4, verse 17 through 24. Cain himself founded a city. An urban society in ancient times, of course, involved the growth of herds of animals. The arts developed with the invention and production of musical instruments. With the use of iron and bronze, the science of metallurgy was created. This advanced culture apparently gave the people a false sense of security. This is reflected in an attitude of carelessness and boastfulness displayed by Lamech, the first polygamist. He prided himself on using superior weapons to destroy life, characteristically absent, by contrast, was any acknowledgement of Elohim for Cain's progeny. After Abel's death and loss of disappointment regarding Cain and as a murderer, the first parent had a new hope with the birth of Seth. Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. It was in the days of Seth's son, Enos, that man began to turn to the Almighty, to Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. Passage of numerous generations and many centuries, another sign of nearness to Yahweh was exemplified in Enoch. This remarkable figure did not experience death. His life of filial piety with Elohim ended with his assumption. With the birth of Noah, hope was revived once again. Lamech, a descendant of Seth, anticipated that through his son, mankind would be comforted from the curse and relieved of it by which they had suffered since man's expulsion from the Garden of Eden. In Noah's days, the growing atheism of civilization reached a real crisis. Yahweh, who had created man and his habitant, was disappointed with his prevailing culture. Marriages between the sons of the Eternal and the daughters of men had displeased him. Corruption, vices, and violence increased to the point that all the plans and action of men were characterized by evil. Yahweh's blessed be He attitude of regret in creating mankind was apparent in the plan to withdraw his spirit from man. A period of 120 years of warning preceded the judgment hanging over the human race. Only Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh, blessed be He. And unblemished, he remained in an acceptable relationship with the Creator. The flood, Elohim's judgment on man, chapter 6, verse 11 through chapter 8, verse 19. Noah was an obedient man. When commanded to build the ark, he followed the instructions, chapter 6, verse 11 to 22. The measurements of the ark still represent the basis or the basic proportions used in boat building. Not designed to sail at speed, the ark was built to house and accommodate all forms of life that had to be preserved during the world's judgment crisis. Ample space was provided to house Noah, his wife, and their three children, three sons, and their wives. A representation of every staple animal and bird and food for all of them. For about a year, Noah was confined to the ark, while the world was subject to divine judgment. Yahweh's purpose to destroy the sinful human race was accomplished. Whether the flood was local or on a global scale is of secondary importance, for the flood extended far enough to include the entire human race. Incessant rains or unstoppable rains and water from underground sources raised the water level above the peaks of the highest mountains. In due course, the water gave way. The ark ended up resting on Mount Ararat. Once man left the ark, he was faced with a new opportunity in a renewed world. The new beginning of man, chapter 8, verse 20 through chapter 11, verse 32. Civilization after the flood began with sacrificial offerings. In response, Yod-Heh-Vah-Peh made a covenant with Noah and his descendants. Never again would the world be destroyed by a new flood. The rainbow in the sky became the perpetual sign of Yahweh's eternal covenant with man. Blessed be He. Blessing Noah, the Eternal commissioned him to populate and take possession of the whole earth. The animals, duly sacrificed, as well as the vegetation, remained as sources of living food. Man, however, remained strictly at the disposal of Yahweh, in whose image he had been created, to avoid the shedding of his blood. Turning to an agrarian purpose, Noah planted a vineyard. His indulgence in the ingestion of the resulting wine resulted in Ham and probably his son Canaan disrespecting him. This incident gave occasion to the fatherly pronouncements of curses and blessings made by Noah, chapter 9, verse 20 through 28. Noah's verdict was prophetic in its scope. He anticipated the sinful attitude of Ham reflected in the line of Canaan, one of Ham's four sons. Now, centuries later, the wicked Canaanites were subjected to severe judgment with the occupation of their lands by the Israelites. Shem and Japhet, Noah's other sons, received their father's blessings. Being a racial and linguistic race, the human race remained in one place for an indefinite period. Chapter 11, verse 1 through 9. On the plain of Shinar, he undertook the project of constructing a tremendous building. The construction of the Tower of Babel represented pride in human accomplishments as well as a challenge to the Eternal, his mandate to populate the entire earth. Yahweh, blessed be He, who had continually taken an interest in man constantly since his creation, could not ignore him then. Apparently, the tower was not destroyed, but Yahweh, blessed be He, ended the attempt by the confusion of tongues. This resulted in the dispersal of the human race. The geographical distribution of Noah's descendants is given in a brief summary. chapter 10, verse 1 through 32. This genealogy, representing a long era, suggests area to which the various families migrated. Japhet and his sons stood in the vicinity of the Black and Caspian Seas, extending westward towards Spain. Chapter 10, verse 2 through 5. Very likely, the Greeks, the Indo-Germanic people, and other related groups are descendants from Japhet. The three sons of Ham went down to Africa. Chapter 10, verse 6 through 14. Subsequently, they expanded northward into the lands of Shinar and Assyria, building cities such as Nineveh, Calah, Babel, Akkad, and others. Canaan, the fourth son of Ham, settled along the Mediterranean, stretching from Sidon to Gaza and eastward. Although Hamites of racial origin, the Canaanites used a language closely related to that of the Semites. Ham and his descendants occupied the northern area of the Persian Gulf. Chapter 10, verse 21 to 31. Elam, Ashur, Aram, and other city names were associated with the Semites. After 2000 years BC, such cities as Mari and Nahor became outstanding centers of Semitic culture. To conclude, the period of beginnings, the end of developments, is reduced to the Semites. Chapter 11, verse 10 through 32. By means of genealogical structure, using 10 generations, the record finally focuses on Terah, who migrated from Ur to Haran. The climate is the introduction of Abram, later known to Abraham, Genesis chapter 17, verse 5, who embodied the beginning of a chosen nation, the nation of Israel, which occupies the center of interest throughout the rest of the Tanakh. Hallelujah. This concludes this study from the Yeshiva class, The Principles. Blessed be his name, and Shalom Aleichem.